The Battle of Homestead became famous even before it happened. In 1892, the Pittsburgh district was then the center of the industrial world and steel the foremost of all industries. At their intersection was the small town of Homestead, the last Union stronghold, just south from Pittsburgh across the Monongahela River. In the months leading up to the June 30th, 1892 expiration date of the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers contract with the Carnegie Steel Company, people across the country and even the world anticipated that Homestead's contract negotiation would be the last great showdown between labor and capital. The Rivers of Steel Museum, where I originally gave this lecture, is at the flashing star at the bottom right of the map. It was then known as the Boast Building. The first step towards the inevitable confrontation began in March of 1892, 125 years ago, when Carnegie's deputy, H.C. Frick, began to build an 11-foot fence around the steel mill property, complete with searchlights, rifle peepholes, and barbed wire. The military-like defenses betrayed his expectation that, despite his perfunctory participation in negotiations with the Union, he would eventually bring in strikebreakers to run the mill without them. Homesteaders called the resulting edifice Fort Frick. This picture, taken much later, gives you a sense of what the fence looked like. Notice from the map and from this photograph that the fence ran across the street from a neighborhood. This was the immigrant neighborhood where the Eastern European immigrants were concentrated. And if we look more closely at who lived in this area, we get to some Jewish Hungarian immigrants near and dear to my heart. My ancestors and their friends. This photograph of 8th Avenue, taken much later, shows what their neighborhood and their stores looked like. The businesses on either side of the starred Boast Building were Jewish-owned stores. So my great-grandfather's first American neighborhood was opposite the steel mill and Fort Frick. He was also on the same block as the Boast Building, which was then the headquarters of the Union. One of Homestead's tallest buildings at a whopping 3 stories, Union leaders could look out the windows and down to the mill on the riverbank and the river itself. The telegraph lines that ran directly into the building meant they could send and receive news fairly quickly. These qualities of the building gave it strategic value for the Union. A major reason why Homestead's mill remained unionized when the other steel unions fell one by one throughout the 1870s and 1880s was the unique partnership between the town and its unions. From its very incorporation in 1880, Homestead was a place where elected town officials were drawn from union leaders who strove to embed in the very fabric of the town the principles of labor rights and republicanism that were on retreat elsewhere. Ordinary homesteaders joined union rallies in large numbers alongside workers to cheer the speakers, and they actively, even zealously, defended Homestead during 2 earlier violent strikes in 1882 and 1889. In both cases, a major factor in the Union's victory was their ability to organize the entire town in order to prevent the steel company and its political allies from bringing in strikebreakers. All of Homestead had been tested by the earlier strikes and emerged stronger. Re-examining these well-known events through the community's perspective points to one of the strike's most significant factors: the ways the advisory committee, the union leaders appointed to coordinate strike activity, did and did not keep control of the situation. Local participants, contemporary observers, and later historians alike claimed the resistance for the whole town because everyone rose up, which exceeded what the advisory committee had intended. As for Carnegie, after losing in 1889, he spent the years that followed resolving to break the Union for once and for all. The man he chose to helm the effort was someone he knew would do whatever it would take: H.C. Frick. After months of sham negotiations, at the end of May, Frick delivered an ultimatum to the Union he knew they would never accept. Frick's deadline came and went, and the following day, Saturday, June 25th, the community beheld notices all over town that the company would no longer deal with the Union. On Tuesday, June 28th, the lockout began when the company closed part of the mill. The following day, the rest of the mill was closed. The steelworkers attended a mass meeting in the town's opera house. The next day, their contract expired. No one reported to work. The mill was silent. Everyone knew Frick intended to bring outside workers to run the mill, as his predecessors had attempted and failed to do in 82 and 89, and as he had often done himself elsewhere. Everyone knew he would first introduce Pinkerton guards to secure the mill. The question was when and how. So the advisory committee prepared its defenses. They took control of the town, closing saloons and organizing patrols to prevent any disturbances that could be used as a pretext for outside authorities to come in. Then they sealed it off, setting up a boat patrol on the Monongahela River and organizing 4,000 workers and townspeople into brigades to guard the mill and all approaches to the town. In 1889, all it had taken was scaring off outside workers at the train station. No one believed it would be that simple this time. One day ticked by, then two. By Sunday, July 3rd, the whole town knew the Pinkertons were on their way. The next day, 4th of July, they observed more quietly than usual. The day after that, July 5th, Frick sent the sheriff of Allegheny County to disperse the Union men guarding the mill and install his own deputies, but the advisory committee politely sent them all away. Now Frick had his pretext. The town remained peaceful until 2:30 a.m. the next morning, July 6th, when a Union scout monitoring the river sent a telegraph to the Post building. The Pinkerton barges were on the move, about to attempt the secret landing on the riverbank below the mill. At 2:40 a.m., the town was awoken by a warning signal. They heard gunshots in the distance from the river. The giant whistle from the Homestead Lightworks screamed through town, then a chorus of sirens from every fire engine, followed by hooves galloping. A rider alerting everyone that the Pinkertons were coming, followed by the chaos of an entire town leaping out of bed and charging towards the steelworks. Observers claimed the entire town arrived at the banks on the Monongahela, Union and non-Union, Carnegie and non-Carnegie workers, Americans and foreigners, even women and children in shocking numbers. None of them listened to the advisory committee's cries for restraint. They ripped down Frick's fence and rushed across the mill grounds to the wharf, where they gathered opposite the Pinkerton barges and screamed for blood. The confrontation hadn't even begun, and the advisory committee had already lost control. The committee pointed to the chaos and begged the Pinkertons not to land, but their captain would not be dissuaded. Within moments of their gangplank hitting the shore, violence broke out, first clubs, then gunshots. In the initial melee, people died on both sides. The advisory committee had called upon all the residents of Homestead, and the residents of Homestead had answered. But where the advisory committee had wanted a disciplined response to preserve the peace, the mob now ruled. And what the mob wanted was to inflict as much damage as they could before the authorities could stop them. The fighting lasted all day. The Pinkertons were trapped on their barges, which the mob tried repeatedly to destroy. Besides gunfire from the men on shore, the nearby railroad bridge, and from skiffs on the rivers, the workers tried dynamite, leftover fireworks from July 4th, even a cannon filched from the Civil War Veterans Lodge. They launched an oil-soaked raft and a burning railroad flat car and went as far as to pour oil on the river and light it. Nothing worked. All the while, the Post building in the middle of town became a makeshift arsenal for the guns the advisory committee went door to door collecting, and it became a communications hub, receiving telegrams of support from workers all over the country. Late in the afternoon, the fighting had reached a stalemate. The Pinkertons wouldn't land and couldn't depart, but the mob could not destroy their barges to force their hand. The eventual solution was that the mob would let the Pinkertons surrender under the assumption they would soon be charged with murder. This solution worked in that the Pinkertons were at last permitted to disembark. But the violence of what followed has proven more durable in American memory than even the 12-hour battle that preceded it. Although the mob was screaming for blood, the Union guarded the Pinkertons and guaranteed them they would be safe. A column of 100 steelworkers carrying the American flag formed to lead them through the steel mill grounds. But almost as soon as they came on shore, the will of the crowd overpowered the restraint of the Union. The crowd parted and formed two long lines on either side of the procession, and as the Pinkertons began to pass, the crowd jeered and swore, pushed, tripped, and threw sand at them, and quickly began outright beating them with fists, sticks, clubs, switches, even a parasol. The Union leaders pled with the crowd to no avail. Observers called it a carnival of revenge. As people in town heard about the surrender, they rushed down 8th Avenue eastward to the main entrance of the steelworks to see for themselves. Although the procession had reformed to better protect the Pinkertons, the beatings continued all down 8th Avenue. Moving west, they passed the hotel at the edge of town where Martin Davidovitz tended bar, then Isidore S. Grossman's clothing store. As the Pinkertons crossed Heisel Street, the heart of the Hungarian neighborhood and the home of my great-grandfather, and approached the Bose building, they were made to take off their hats and salute the American flag hanging from the window, whereupon they were beaten yet harder. They passed Levi Meyer's clothing store, Abraham Skirbaugh's building, and then countless more homes and businesses as they wound through town on their 5.5 blocks. The procession grew larger as townspeople followed. The procession arrived at the Fifth Avenue Opera House, where the Pinkertons were locked until the county sheriff could return to arrest and charge them. Homestead went wild. They had been victorious, or so it had seemed. That evening, the sheriff did arrive at Homestead to pick up the Pinkertons. They were taken to Pittsburgh, where they were quickly dispersed to New York and Chicago. None was ever charged. The Union held the town for 5 more days. On the morning of July 12th, 2 trains pulled into Munhall Station and unloaded 4,000 troops. Homestead was under martial law. 3 days later, the steel mill was restarted with strikebreakers brought in from elsewhere. When the steelworkers caught sight of the smoke, they rushed to the mill, but the militia held them off. The militia remained encamped on the hill where the Carnegie Library now stands until mid-October, patrolling the town and protecting the steelworks and the ever-growing number of strikebreakers operating the mill and living in company housing on its grounds. The strike lasted another month. The steelworkers voted to return to work just before Thanksgiving. There are lots of ways to look at the events of the Battle of Homestead. I hope this one gave you a sense of what it meant to the town's whole community. Homestead was a remarkable place before the strike, a place where people of all backgrounds united to protect the rights of one class of workers. The largest and most privileged group, to be sure, but that unification set the tone for how the rest of the town conducted its business, up to the highest levels of governance, the Borough Council, where union leaders led the town as well. Homestead exited the strike a broken place. During the strike, a depression settled on the town. Steelworkers couldn't afford work, so they didn't have money. Merchants sold on credit till they couldn't afford to. Property values were depressed. Taxes went unpaid. Men who participated in the strike were not permitted to resume work in the mill. The town had to organize charitable efforts for their families. Some local merchants protested they shouldn't have to give since they were already selling on credit. Others did contribute. When contributions started pouring in from all around the country, some citizens were embarrassed and protested that things weren't as bad as people thought. But the union was broken, and so was the town, in ways that would endure for decades. This short video was drawn from a longer lecture that I gave at the Rivers of Steel Museum in April 2017 to kick off the commemoration of the 125th anniversary of the Battle of Homestead. Thank you for watching.